The hospital room was a cage of sterile white, its walls closing in on Margaret Hale as she lay in the stiff bed. The beep of the heart monitor her only companion. At 78, her body was frail, but her mind was a vault of memories, each one sharp and vivid, cutting deeper than the 4 in her arm. She had lived a life of quiet sacrifice, raising her daughter, Clara, alone after her husband's death. Every choice she'd made, every late-night shift at the diner, every penny saved for Clara's college had been for her. But now, as pneumonia tightened its grip on her lungs, Margaret was alone. Clara hadn't visited in weeks. The room smelled of antiseptic and regret. Margaret's fingers traced the edges of a worn photograph on her bedside table, one of her and Clara at the girls' high school graduation. Clara's smile was bright, her eyes full of dreams. Margaret had believed in those dreams, had poured her heart into them. But somewhere along the way, Clara had changed. The daughter who once clung to her mother's hand now saw Margaret as a burden, a relic of a life she'd outgrown. Margaret's thoughts drifted to the last time Clara had come to the hospital. 3 weeks ago, her daughter had stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, her designer purse slung over her shoulder. "I can't keep coming here, Mom," Clara had said. Her voice clipped. "I have a life. You know. Work. Meetings. Responsibilities." Margaret had nodded, swallowing the ache in her chest. She'd wanted to say, "I'm your mother. I'm your responsibility too." But she hadn't. She never did. Now, the silence of the room was louder than Clara's absence. Margaret's doctor, a kind-eyed man named Dr. Ellis, had warned her that the pneumonia was worsening. "You need rest, Margaret," he'd said that morning, his voice gentle but firm. "And you need someone here with you." Margaret had smiled weakly, muttering something about Clara being busy. But the truth was a weight she couldn't shake. Clara wasn't coming. As the days blurred together, Margaret's thoughts turned inward. She remembered the years of scraping by, the nights she'd gone hungry so Clara could have new shoes. She'd never asked for thanks, but she'd hoped for love. Instead, Clara had built a life that had no room for her moth-era life of corporate success. A sleek apartment downtown, and a fiancé who barely acknowledged Margaret's existence. The last time Clara had called, it was to ask for money to cover a business expense. Margaret had sent what little she had, as always. But now, lying in that hospital bed, Margaret felt something shift inside her. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was clarity. For the first time, she saw her sacrifices not as acts of love, but as offerings to someone who didn't value them. The realization stung, but it also sparked something fierce in her, resolve she hadn't felt in years. That evening, a nurse named Sarah, who had a warm smile and a habit of sneaking Margaret extra pudding, stopped by. "You doing okay, Miss Margaret?" she asked, adjusting the foreline. Margaret nodded, but her eyes lingered on the empty chair by her bed. Sarah followed her gaze and sighed. "You deserve better. You know," she said softly. Margaret didn't respond, but Sarah's words lingered, planting a seed. The next morning, Margaret asked for a pen and paper. Her hands trembled as she wrote, not from weakness, but from the weight of what she was about to do. She wasn't sure what her future held, whether she'd leave this hospital alive or not, but she knew one thing. She was done giving to someone who gave nothing back. She began to draft a letter, not to Clara, but to her lawyer. It was the first step toward a decision that would change everything. As she wrote, memories flooded back, Clara's first steps, her laughter as a child, the way she'd once looked at Margaret like she was the whole world. But those memories were overshadowed by the present, by the empty chair, the unanswered calls, the cold indifference. Margaret's heart ached, but her resolve hardened. She wasn't just writing a letter. She was rewriting her legacy. By the time she finished, the page was filled with her careful, deliberate script. She folded it, sealed it in an envelope, and handed it to Sarah with a request to mail it. "This is important," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. Sarah nodded, sensing the gravity of the moment. Margaret leaned back against the pillows, exhausted but strangely at peace. She didn't know if Clara would ever understand, or if she'd even care. But for the first time in years, Margaret felt like she was taking control not of Clara's life, but of her own. The hospital days stretched into a monotonous haze, each one blending into the next. Margaret's condition stabilized, but the weight of her decision grew heavier. The letter to her lawyer, Mr. Thompson, had been sent, and with it, the first draft of her new will. She hadn't disinherited Clarinot yet, but she'd instructed Mr. Thompson to explore options for redirecting her modest estate. It wasn't much: a small house, a savings account, and a few cherished heirlooms. But it was all she had, and she wanted it to mean something. Margaret's thoughts often returned to Clara's childhood. There was a time when her daughter had been her shadow, trailing her through the diner where Margaret worked, giggling as she helped wipe down tables. Those were the years when love felt simple, when a hug from Clara could erase the exhaustion of a double shift. But as Clara grew, so did her ambition. College had been the turning point. Margaret had worked overtime to pay for it, proud to give Clara the opportunities she'd never had. But Clara's world expanded, and Margaret's shrank. By the time Clara graduated, her visits home grew rare, her calls perfunctory. Now, as Margaret stared at the ceiling tiles, she wondered where she'd gone wrong. Had she given too much? Had she failed to teach Clara gratitude? Or was it simply that Clara had chosen a life that left no room for her mother? The questions gnawed at her, but they also fueled her resolve. She wasn't just changing her will. She was reclaiming her dignity. Dr. Ellis stopped by one afternoon, his brow furrowed. "Margaret, your vitals are improving, but you're not eating enough," he said, glancing at the untouched tray of hospital food. "You need to fight for yourself." His words hit harder than he knew. Margaret nodded, forcing a bite of cold mashed potatoes. She wasn't just fighting for her health. She was fighting for her worth. Sarah, the nurse, became Margaret's lifeline. She'd sit with her during breaks, sharing stories about her own family. "My mom and I fight sometimes," Sarah admitted one evening, "but I can't imagine not being there for her." Margaret listened, her heart twisting. She wanted to tell Sarah about Clara, about the ache of being forgotten, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she asked Sarah about her dreams, her life outside the hospital. Sarah's eyes lit up as she talked about wanting to open a bakery one day. "Nothing fancy," she said, "just a place where people feel at home." Margaret smiled, imagining it. For the first time, she wondered what it would be like to leave something for someone like Sarah, someone who cared. A week later, Mr. Thompson called. His voice was calm but professional, the kind of tone that carried weight. "I received your letter, Margaret," he said. "Are you sure about this? It's a big decision." Margaret gripped the phone, her heart pounding. "I'm sure," she said. She asked him to draft a will that left her estate to a local charity, one that supported single mothers like she'd been. It felt right, like a way to honor her own struggles and give others a chance she'd fought for. But doubt crept in at night, when the hospital was quiet, and her thoughts were loud. Disinheriting Clara felt like severing a part of herself. She remembered the night Clara was born, how she'd held her tiny body and promised to protect her forever. Hadn't she kept that promise? Why couldn't Clara keep hers? The questions kept Margaret awake, her mind wrestling with love and betrayal. One morning, Clara called. Her voice was rushed, impatient. Mom, I heard you're doing better. That's good. Look, I'm swamped, but I'll try to stop by soon. Margaret waited for an apology, for some sign of warmth, but none came. Clara, she said softly, I needed you here. There was a pause, then a sigh. I know, Mom. I'm trying. I'll call later. The line went dead, and Margaret's heart sank. Clara wasn't coming not because she couldn't, but because she wouldn't. That call sealed Margaret's decision. She asked Sarah to bring her more paper, and she began writing again, not a letter this time, but a journal of her life. She wrote about her sacrifices, her love for Clara, and the pain of her daughter's absence. It was a way to make sense of it all, to leave a record of who she was. She didn't know if Clara would ever read it, but it felt like a final act of honesty. As she wrote, Margaret felt a strange sense of freedom. She wasn't just letting go of Clara. She was letting go of the guilt, the hope that things could be different. For the first time, she saw her life as her own, not defined by what she'd given to someone else. Margaret's journal became her refuge. Each night, when the hospital grew still, she poured her heart onto the pages. She wrote about her childhood, growing up poor in a small town, and how she dreamed of a different life for Clara. She wrote about her husband, Thomas, whose death had left her a widow at 30, and how she'd rebuilt her life for their daughter. But she also wrote about the present, the loneliness, the betrayal, the slow realization that love couldn't be forced. Her health was improving, but the doctors warned her recovery would be slow. Pneumonia had weakened her lungs, and she'd need care even after leaving the hospital. The thought of returning to her empty house was daunting, but Margaret refused to let it break her. She'd survived worse. Sarah noticed the change in Margaret. You seem stronger, she said one day, adjusting the pillows. Not just physically, but here. She tapped her chest. Margaret smiled faintly. I'm finding my way, she said. Sarah didn't press, but her presence was a quiet comfort, a reminder that kindness still existed. One afternoon, Mr. Thompson visited in person. He was a wiry man in his 60s, with glasses that slid down his nose. He carried a briefcase and a look of concern. Margaret, I've drafted the will as you asked, he said, handing her a folder. The estate goes to the single mother's fund, with a small provision for your care. But I need you to be absolutely certain. He paused, studying her. Clara won't take this well. Margaret opened the folder, her eyes scanning the document. The words were cold. Final, Clara Hale is to receive no portion of the estate. Her heart clenched, but she nodded. It's what I want, she said. She's made her choice. Mr. Thompson hesitated, then sighed. I'll file it tomorrow. If you change your mind, let me know. Margaret thanked him, but she knew she wouldn't. That night, she dreamed of Clara as a child, running through a field, her laughter echoing. In the dream, Margaret reached for her, but Clara kept running, fading into the distance. When she woke, tears stained her pillow. She didn't regret her decision, but the pain of it was a wound that wouldn't heal. A few days later, Sarah brought news that shook Margaret. I overheard the nurses talking, she said, her voice low. Clara called the hospital. She asked about your condition, but didn't say she was coming. Margaret's chest tightened. She'd hoped foolishly. Perhaps that Clara might show up, might prove her wrong. But the call was just another reminder of her daughter's distance. Margaret turned to her journal, writing with a ferocity she hadn't felt before. She wrote about the moment she'd realized Clara didn't love her the way she'd hoped, how it wasn't about money or time, but about respect. She wrote about the will, not out of spite, but as a way to honor her own life. I gave her everything, she wrote. but I can't give her my worth. As the days passed, Margaret began to plan for her future. She couldn't stay in the hospital forever, and she refused to be a burden to anyone. She asked Sarah about local care facilities, one she could afford with her savings. Sarah hesitated, then said, "You could come stay with me, Miss Margaret. I've got a spare room." Margaret laughed, thinking it was a joke, but Sarah's eyes were serious. "I mean it," she said. "You're family to me now." The offer stunned Margaret. She'd spent so long giving without receiving that the idea of someone caring for her felt foreign. She didn't accept not yet, but the offer warmed her, like sunlight breaking through clouds. For the first time, she saw a future beyond the hospital, one where she wasn't alone. By the end of the week, Margaret's strength was returning. She could sit up for longer, even walk a few steps with Sarah's help. But her heart was still heavy. She knew the will would hurt Clara, maybe even destroy their relationship for good. Yet she also knew it was the only way to protect herself, to ensure her life's work went to those who needed it. As she closed her journal that night, Margaret wrote one final line: "I loved her with all I had, but I'm learning to love myself too." Margaret's discharge day arrived like a quiet victory. She was still weak, her steps slow and deliberate, but the doctors deemed her stable enough to leave. Sarah helped her pack her few belongings: a nightgown, her journal, the photograph of Clara. As they folded the clothes, Margaret felt a pang of uncertainty. The hospital had been a cocoon, shielding her from the world. Now, she had to face it. Sarah drove her to the small house Margaret had called home for decades. The sight of it brought a rush of memories: Clara's tricycle in the yard, birthday parties in the living room, quiet evenings with Thomas before he passed. But the house felt different now. Too still, too empty. Margaret clutched her journal as she stepped inside, as if it could anchor her. Over the next few days, Margaret settled into a routine. Sarah visited often, bringing homemade soup and stories about her bakery dreams. Margaret listened, marveling at the young woman's warmth. She began to see Sarah not just as a nurse, but as a friend, maybe even the daughter she'd longed for Clara to be. The thought was bittersweet, but it gave her strength. One evening, Clara called again. Her voice was sharp, almost accusing. "Mom, you're out of the hospital. Why didn't you tell me?" Margaret took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I didn't think you'd care," she said, her voice calm but firm. Clara sputtered, caught off guard. "Of course I care. I've been busy. That's all." Margaret wanted to believe her, but the words felt hollow. "Clara," she said, "I needed you. You weren't there." There was silence, then a click. Clara had hung up. The call left Margaret shaken, but it also clarified something. Clara wasn't going to change, not now. Maybe not ever. Margaret turned to her journal, writing about the conversation, about the pain of letting go. She wrote about Sarah, too, and the unexpected bond they'd formed. It wasn't a replacement for Clara, but it was something real, something she could hold on to. A week later, Mr. Thompson called to confirm the will had been finalized. "It's done, Margaret," he said. "The estate is set for the single mother's fund. If you want to make any changes, you still can." Margaret thanked him but declined. The decision felt final, like closing a book she'd been reading too long. But life had a way of surprising her. One morning, Sarah arrived with a folder of her own. "I've been working on something," she said, her eyes bright. Inside the folder were sketches for her bakery floor plans, menus, even a name: Margaret's Place. "I named it after you," Sarah said, blushing. "You've inspired me, Miss Margaret. You're so strong." Margaret's throat tightened. She didn't know what to say, so she hugged Sarah, tears spilling over. The gesture moved Margaret deeply. She began to think about her legacy in a new way, not just as money or possessions, but as the impact she could have on others. She asked Sarah about the bakery, offering small suggestions based on her years at the diner. Sarah listened eagerly, scribbling notes. For the first time, Margaret felt like she was part of something again. But Clara's absence still loomed. Margaret hadn't heard from her since the phone call, and she didn't expect to. She wondered if Clara would ever understand why she'd changed the will, or if she'd see it as an act of spite. Margaret didn't want that. She wanted Clara to grow, to learn what family meant. But she couldn't force it. As the days passed, Margaret's strength grew. She started walking to the mailbox, then to the corner store. Each step felt like a reclaiming of her life. She wrote in her journal every night, filling page after page with reflections on love, loss, and resilience. She wrote about Sarah's bakery, about the single mother's fund, about the future she was building for herself. One evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sunset, Margaret felt a quiet peace. She'd spent so long defining herself as Clara's mother. But now she was simply Margaret, someone who had loved deeply, hurt deeply, and was learning to live for herself. The will wasn't about punishing Clara. It was about honoring her own worth. Spring arrived, painting Margaret's small garden with color. She spent mornings tending to the flowers, her hands steady despite their age. The physical work grounded her, a reminder that she was still here, still capable. Sarah's visits became a highlight, each one filled with laughter and plans for the bakery. Margaret had even started baking again, testing recipes for Sarah's menu. It felt good to create, to contribute. But Clara's silence was a shadow. Margaret hadn't heard from her in months, not since the tense phone call. She tried not to dwell on it, but the pain was there, a dull ache that flared at unexpected moments. She wondered if Clara knew about the will, if that was why she'd stayed away. Part of her wanted to reach out, to explain, but she held back. Clara had to make her own choices. One afternoon, Sarah arrived with a surprise, a mock-up of a sign for Margaret's place. The letters were bold, framed by a border of tiny flowers. "I thought you'd like to see it," Sarah said, beaming. Margaret traced the letters with her finger, overwhelmed. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Sarah hugged her, and for a moment, Margaret felt like she'd found a new kind of family. That evening, Margaret wrote in her journal about legacy. "I used to think my legacy was Clara," she wrote. "But maybe it's bigger than that. Maybe it's the people I've touched, the ones who've touched me." She thought of Sarah, of the single mother's fund, of the women who'd benefit from her estate. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to make a difference. A few days later, a letter arrived from Clara. Margaret's heart raced as she opened it, her fingers trembling. The words were curt, almost formal. "Mom, I heard about the will. I can't believe you'd do this. I'm your daughter. How could you?" There was no apology, no attempt to understand, just anger. Margaret read the letter twice, then set it aside. She felt no anger in return, only sadness and a strange relief. Clara's reaction confirmed what she'd known deep down. Her daughter wasn't ready to change. Margaret didn't respond to the letter. Instead, she called Mr. Thompson to ensure the will was airtight. "I don't want her to contest it," she said. Mr. Thompson assured her it was solid. "You've done what you needed to, Margaret," he said. "Now live your life." His words echoed Dr. Ellis's advice from the hospital: fight for yourself. And so she did. Margaret started volunteering at a local community center, helping single mothers with resume writing and job applications. She shared her story, not the details of Clara's abandonment, but the lessons she'd learned about resilience and self-worth. The women listened, their eyes reflecting struggles Margaret knew well. She felt useful again, like her life had purpose. Sarah's bakery plans moved forward, and Margaret became her unofficial advisor. They spent evenings poring over budgets and recipes, laughing over burnt cookies and dreaming of the day Margaret's place would open. Sarah insisted Margaret be there for the ribbon cutting, and Margaret promised she would. One night, as she wrote in her journal, Margaret realized she no longer felt defined by Clara's absence. She was proud of the woman. She was becoming someone who could love fiercely, but also let go. She wrote about forgiveness, not for Clara's sake, but for her own. I forgive her, she wrote, because I deserve peace. As spring turned to summer, Margaret's health continued to improve. She walked farther, laughed more, lived more. She knew Clara might never come back, might never understand. But that was okay. Margaret had found her own path, one paved with purpose and unexpected connections. Her heart was still scarred, but it was beating stronger than ever. Summer brought warmth to Margaret's world, both literal and figurative. Her garden bloomed wildly, and her days were filled with small joys: coffee with Sarah, volunteering at the community center, and quiet evenings with her journal. She'd found a rhythm, a life that felt full despite the hole Clara had left. One morning, Sarah arrived with news. Margaret's place had secured a lease. The bakery was happening. "We're doing this," Sarah said, her eyes shining. Margaret hugged her, pride swelling in her chest. She'd never imagined her name on anything, let alone a place that would bring people together. Sarah insisted Margaret be her partner not financially, but in spirit. "You're the heart of this," Sarah said. Margaret didn't argue. The community center became Margaret's second home. She mentored a young mother named Lena, who reminded her of herself at 30, determined but exhausted. Lena had a toddler and no family to lean on, and Margaret saw her own struggles in the woman's tired eyes. She helped Lena find a job, even babysat her son one afternoon. It felt like coming full circle, like her life's pain had a purpose. But Clara's letter still lingered in Margaret's mind. She hadn't responded, hadn't known how. Part of her wanted to explain, to tell Clara why she'd changed the will not out of anger, but to protect her own heart. Another part of her knew it wouldn't matter. Clara's world was too far from hers now. One evening, as Margaret watered her garden, a car pulled up. Her heart stopped when she saw Clara step out. Her daughter looked older, her face drawn, her designer purse nowhere in sight. "Mom," Clara said, her voice small. Margaret set down the watering can, her hand shaking. "Clara," she said, unsure what to feel. They sat on the porch, the silence heavy. Clara spoke first. "I was wrong," she said, her voice breaking. "I should have been there. I was scared. Scared of losing you. Scared of failing you." Margaret listened, her heart torn between hope and caution. Clara's words were raw, but they didn't erase the months of absence, the years of distance. "I changed the will," Margaret said finally, her voice steady. "Not to hurt you, but to honor myself." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "I know," she said. "I don't deserve it. I want to try again." Margaret studied her daughter, searching for the girl she'd raised. She saw glimpses of her, but also a woman shaped by choices Margaret couldn't undo. They talked for hours, not fixing everything, but starting. Clara admitted she'd been consumed by her career, by a life that felt empty now. Margaret shared her pain, her strength, her new purpose. It wasn't a reconciliation night yet, but it was a step. Clara visited again the next week, and the week after. They were cautious with each other, rebuilding on fragile ground. Margaret didn't change the will back, and Clara didn't ask her to. Instead, they focused on small things: shared coffee, Old stories. Moments of laughter. Margaret knew it might not last, but she was willing to try. The day Margaret's place opened, the bakery was packed. Sarah beamed behind the counter. Serving pastries Margaret had helped perfect. Lena was there with her son, and the women from the community center filled the tables. Clara came too, standing quietly in the back. When their eyes met, Margaret smiled, and Clara smiled back. That night, Margaret wrote in her journal one last time. I thought my story was about loss. She wrote, but it's about finding myself. Clara may never fully understand, but I do. And that's enough. She closed the journal, her heart full. She'd lost a daughter, but she'd gained a life one she'd built with her own strength, surrounded by people who saw her worth. As she looked out at her garden, now glowing under the moonlight, Margaret felt at peace. Her legacy wasn't in money or possessions, but in the love she'd given, the lives she'd touched, and the woman she'd become. She was ready for whatever came next.